Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Theology Re-Examined. Today, I have with me an incredible guest, Joshua Ryan Butler. Joshua, welcome.
Hey, Ethan. Thanks so much, man. Really excited to talk.
Yeah. Well, here today we are specifically on to talk about your new book that just released on March 5th, and the book is it's a good one. So I got a chance to read through the entire thing. I finished it this
Awesome.
morning, and I have to say it was probably the quickest I've read any book within like the last year at least. Uh,
Yes.
it was like 3 days it took me, and it's not. I mean, it's well, I think
Wow.
without the bibliography, like 180 pages or something.
Wow.
And so it was a really easy, amazing read for me, and it's all about politics. Which the name of the book is called The Party Crasher, and the subtitle is wait, can you remind me? It's
Yeah. So it's how Jesus disrupts politics as usual and redeems our partisan divide.
yeah, I love it. And I love the cover too. That was a
Oh
really
yeah.
good idea.
That's yeah, it's a buddy
Yeah,
of
you
mine,
got that.
Jesse
I love
Lesko.
the
Actually,
donkey.
we were brainstorming, and he actually had the Party Crasher title idea. He came up with when we were brainstorming, and he had the idea for the pinatas of the elephant and the donkey with kind of the party confetti and stuff on the cover as well, which I love, man. Yeah, it's a fun title and cover.
Yeah, dude. Um, so just before we start, though, getting
Yeah.
into that specifically, I first encountered your work over because this is you and I's first conversation,
Yes.
and I originally encountered your work. I think it was a little bit over a year ago,
Yes.
listening to a podcast on Theology in the Raw
Oh yes.
about your book, Beautiful Union.
Yes.
And of course, there was that controversy around there with the excerpt that got taken out of context, that whole thing, right? But
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about you or your work, and I listened to it. Um, but as I was listening, and I listened actually on a car ride with my wife, and we
Mm.
were listening, and it was like I've never encountered this guy, uh, but the way that he's carrying himself right now,
Mm.
it immediately made me a Joshua Ryan Butler fan.
Oh man,
And
thank you.
it really made me want to read
Yeah.
Beautiful Union. Even though I never ended up getting my hands on it, it's still on my want to
Yeah.
read list. But I was like, after listening to the composure that you had, especially because it was a conversation with like several other people, and from my perspective at least, listening in from the outside, it sounded. I felt like you were almost getting a little bit attacked and misrepresented. Um, and I just remember being like, I haven't read the book. I haven't even read the article. I don't care too much what it says. This dude looks like Jesus. Like the way that
Oh
he
man.
is being extremely loving, responding in humility, like showing a ton of compassion. I could have cared less what your book said. Not really, but kind of. I was compelled, and my wife was too. We still talk about it to this day. And so when I
Wow.
told her, I was like, "Oh, he's coming on the podcast," and we were just reminiscing about the way that that conversation went and how amazing you handled yourself. And so this for me is a full circle moment. And so I'm excited to be talking to you about this today.
Oh man, thank you so much, Ethan. That's really encouraging to hear. And yeah, I love, man, not only Preston, but Brenna and Sandy on that podcast. That was my first time interacting with them, and as well, and getting to know, especially Brenna since then, and Sandy. They're just amazing. It was such a great conversation, and thanks, man. That's encouraging to hear. And dude, I'm stoked to get the chance to, yeah, connect with you and talk more about Jesus and theology and the whole and politics and everything. But yeah,
Politics.
thanks for that. That's really encouraging to hear, man.
Yeah. Well, if you can start us off, then I'm curious to hear what was your main motive for writing a book on politics at such an
Yeah.
untimely period.
Yeah. Yeah, so backdrop. So I've been a pastor for a little bit over 20 years, and have just seen increasingly, like the last two election seasons in 2016, 2020, man, just so much where the partisan divide has grown as wide as ever, feels like, and seeing that divide fracturing families, fracturing friendships, fracturing churches, To give one illustration, there was a church in our network in 2020, a network of about 10 churches, and one of those churches basically split over political division. 1,500 out of 3,000 people left angry, And the backdrop, it seemed very small. My particular, like the lead pastor had put out a video on social media, and it was, it seemed tame and just, yeah, it seemed very reasonable and great. But there was a small crew of about 7 to 8 people who were kind of influential members in the church who left angry, and they started kind of these coffee shop conversations and email chains and things to try and take down the church. And they started scouring every pastor's sermon in the network, all the sermons we were doing. They started scouring not only pastors but their spouses, like social media feeds, and again just looking for ammo to take down the church. There were claims like the lead pastor's under the influence of Satan, and there was like a viral video claiming that in our region. There was another anyways, man, it was just like slander and gossip. It didn't take much to one conversation, like dismantled a lot of the things that people were accusing that just weren't true. They hadn't been said in that video. They weren't actually true. And that was heartbreaking, as a church in our network to see that. And I wish that was a one-off case, but I know so many pastors nationally, and just stories of churches across the country here. I'm in the United States here, so countries here in this context, where the division is just as wide as ever. And it's not only that; it's very up close and personal for so many people I know, with relationships, friendships, family members that have been fractured by the political division. So my real heart in the book was to say how, on the front end, as we head into another election season, what are some of the lessons learned? There's some things that we did in our congregation. We didn't do everything perfectly, but there's some things we did in our church during the last election season that seemed to really help our people weather the storm well. And I wanted to just try and offer some of those thoughts and reflections, hopefully as a resource for how we can put Jesus front and center and walk faithfully through the political season ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, and you have several stories within the book that help bring, I think, in real practical ways to surface like how much our pledge of allegiance towards a specific party or towards a specific ideology that's within a party, how that can cause a ton of damage within a community. And those stories were part of what helped me a lot, just really understand it on a real fundamental practical level. And so I'd be curious, could you help us or share with us another one of those big stories that you mentioned throughout the book of like helping it connect just how big of a deal it is that people approach this in a correct way? Otherwise, I've seen this type of thing happen with people who handle it poorly.
Yeah. We know one, kind of a humorous example, I would say, but, I remember one Sunday after church, there was this visitor who approached us and some of the leaders, and he was like, "Hey, why do you guys have these All Lives Matter posters all over your church?" And I was like, "What All Lives Matter posters? What's he talking about? We don't have, and he's like, "No, you guys have these All Lives Matter posters plastered all over your church." And I'm wondering, like, man, did we get like graffitied or tagged or what's there? So we're like, "Can you show us these posters?" So he takes us around the church and going, "Oh, it was we did have these, vision statements. Our vision for over 10 years as a church, and it was plastered all over church, was all of life is all for Jesus." Like, all of life is all for Jesus. And he was reading that and thinking, like, all lives matter,
Yeah.
And he was coming from the left and was concerned about, oh, we're this right wing, whatever. And it was just, dude, but he had this filter on and was hearing
Mm-hmm.
stuff we weren't saying. But we also experienced that with people coming from the right, where another Sunday around that time, one of the pastors gave a message, and he was talking about progressive sanctification, which is, this idea that we don't get sanctified overnight. We don't become holy in a day. It's a gradual, progressive process over time. But after the sermon, there was this angry woman, this woman who came up just angry and irate at him, and just like, why are you saying that if I'm being sanctified, I'm going to be becoming more progressive? And the next day he got to his the next day he got to his email, and there were two emails from other people in the church angry, thinking he was saying the same thing. And so those are kind of humorous extreme examples, but I think we've seen a way more, way more broadly, just in generally, that it's like those illustrate something that I think is way bigger, which is that we often have these ideological filters on, and we're hearing everything through that grid. And often we're maybe in kind of an echo chamber of our own social media bubble, maybe our own relational bubble, and it becomes way easier to dehumanize just kind of other people outside of that bubble and to filter everything through that grid. And that can really distort our understanding of where other people are coming from and what we think they're saying that they may not be saying.
Yeah, yeah, the echo chamber. That was a big theme is not, not being within your own little echo chamber where you just have all your same ideas getting, pushed right back into your ear and people affirming what you have to say. You had this line in the book. You said, "Healthy political discipleship means your relationships will cross party lines." And when you said that, it really made me think and reflect for myself, and say, in what ways or how politically diverse is my own close circle? Am I within my own echo chamber? And am I allowing myself to get into a place where the next time my pastor talks about progressive sanctification, I'm reading into what he's saying and starting to come around or come about with my own presuppositions and import that into his language and not allow him to speak on his own terms? And then just even getting that at a more microscopic level, it's like, then I start to do that within my own one-on-one interactions with my friends. And I misrepresent them, and I, just hear things that they're saying that they really aren't. Um, and yeah, yeah, that was something that made me really reflect. So I appreciated you saying that.
Mm. Yeah, and it's interesting. I think it's getting harder to have those relationships across ideological party lines or whatever today, because there's this influential book a while back, The Big Sort by Bill Bishop, and he makes the case that that Americans have sorted themselves increasingly into like homogeneous bubbles. People who think the same way generally that they do, and his observation with some of the studies on that was really fascinating. But is that the way he put it, that mixed company moderates, but homogeneous company pushes you to the extremes. And so
Mhm.
there's a sense that like when you interact with people who see the world differently than you, it can actually strengthen your convictions. You can kind of go, oh, because you have to nuance and understand it in relation to their arguments. But if you are surrounded only by people who see the world the same way that you do, it can push you towards the extremes of that thinking. And I think that is increasingly hard to avoid today, because not only geographically have we often sorted ourselves into, whether you're in the urban core or you're in the Midwest or different places, pockets of society. I look at in the book about some of the ideologies that are prominent in different arenas of American society. But even more so in the online world, it's like algorithms and so on are pushing us more into those echo chambers and feeding us things that reinforce our ideological narrative. And we're in that spot, it becomes way easier to uh, dehumanize or caricature people who are not in the same pocket that you are.
Yeah. Yeah, and you talked about the algorithms. In the book, you said that you and your church did a social media fast. And that you even said there was some pushback where somebody said they were like, oh, what was it? Oh, aren't we just gonna be, disengaging with the real world? And,
Mm.
then you kind of help them realize that no, social media is really not the real world. And then I think you gave an example where you had people like pull up their social media feeds right next to each other who were on different sides of the ideological spectrum when it comes to politics. And it was like both of their social media feeds were just pushing them hardcore takes from the opposite side, trying to enrage them. And it's like, oh, this isn't real life.
Yeah, totally. So on the social media fast, so the backdrop to that, we did engage during the year trying to prepare people for the election season and just to process through the stuff involved. But what we did was when it got 40 days out from election
Hmm.
day, right? 40 days out, we called our people to like, okay, let's take a social media fast. And the idea was not that it doesn't matter, it's not important, but it was going, everybody's mind's already made up pretty much, like by this point, the idea being that like most people's minds are made up and most of the conversation out there is not going to be that fruitful, and so let's take a fast from just the vitriol, everything out there, and intentionally really pray for the election, pray for our city, pray for our nation, pray for, and really enter into an intentional time of prayer. And like you said, yeah, one of the pushbacks was like, oh, well, that feels like we're disengaging from the real world. It's kind of going, dude, social media is not the real world. Like I enjoy being on social media, and there's a lot of great stuff, and you can, there's benefits, but the reality is that it's often driven by, algorithms and people with billions of dollars trying to push you into uh, those what I call in the book, the four quadrants that can
Hmm.
kind of fracture our communities and our perspectives even more. And found the real world can often be, by taking times, strategic times where maybe we fast from some of those things and we reconnect with like real relationships, flesh and blood, and ideally with people who may not see the world the same way we do, but we're asking a lot of questions, trying to glean and learn and understand, and interact and engage with folks. I think that a fast like that can actually help us re-engage with the real
Hmm.
world in a way that can balance out some of those distortions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you had just said that you were in the book talking about a lot of the different spectrums within America. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, because this book does seem very American centric in a sense,
Yes.
but personally, I'm in Europe right now studying, and it was really interesting seeing some of the things that you were saying while living in Europe and being
Hmm.
like, I don't know if that's really how it is here, because there does seem like there's a big difference. At least living
Yes.
here, I haven't run into the same types of conversations surrounding politics that I would sitting around the dinner table or Thanksgiving table back home. Uh, do you have any experience of living outside of the U.S. or do you like? What is your experience, I guess, with politics even outside of the U.S.?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I did, write the book particularly for America, for people who are Christians in America, first and foremost, kind of context. Hopefully, there's stuff that might be helpful more broadly. But part of my own backdrop, yeah. So I lived for 3 months in East Africa, in Rwanda and Congo. Not, they've spent 3 months, and I spent a lot of time over the years. I was a global pastor back in the day, working predominantly in Vietnam and Cambodia. Traveled a bunch, spent time working in about 12 different countries, but most
Well,
of the time in Vietnam, Cambodia. And that's part of the backdrop even for my interest in political theology. So in Vietnam, was working with kind of leaders in underground churches there, often like pastors who had been thrown in jail or in prison for their faith, churches that had been, the buildings demolished and shut down, their people scattered, and so they were in a context of often explicit persecution, and also worked with leaders there from the state church who were collaborating more openly, working with the government. I worked in Cambodia where there was more heavy corruption. It was just blatant. It had to do with some of the structures of the way. And that's a long conversation, but there was just a lot of corruption with government that churches were trying to navigate as they're serving their communities. And then I was in Portland, Oregon, in the Northwest, and we were, which was known for kind of like being a bit hostile towards churches and the Christian faith. And yet we were working collaboratively with the mayor's office, doing a lot of initiatives together with the city. And in that, I just became very interested in how does the church ideally relate with the state, the government, or like what are the healthy, where are the boundaries that we need to protect kind of the integrity of who we are, what we're doing, but then how do we really constructively uh, be involved for kind of civic flourishing in our city, and how does that look in Portland, Oregon versus Hanoi, Vietnam, versus Phnom Penh in Cambodia, or like these different places that can contextually look very differently, but beneath it all, I think kind of a similar question of how does pledging our highest allegiance to Jesus as Lord, how does that shape our civic presence and kind of political witness in whatever environment God has us?
Yeah, yeah, and I affirm that. I mean, just so I'm clear, anybody who's listening and is not from the U.S., I still 100% recommend Josh's book. Uh, yeah, definitely. I think for all people in all spectrums, that was one of the things that I really also appreciated about this text. Is one of the things I noticed is that I feel like this could very well be read and then the principles be applied, not just when it comes to politics, but when it comes to literally any diverse belief or understanding. So, like, even for me, I do a lot of theology. I talk about a lot of theology, biblical studies, difference in interpretations, whatever it is. And the things and the principles that you bring to the surface in this book, I was just thinking the entire time, okay, this isn't just for politics. Like, this is for every little piece of, I mean, this is what, like, doing life and interacting with people who think differently with you, and learning how to love them is kingdom ministry. It's kingdom work, and I think your book like hits the nail on the head with how to approach it. You talk about the 10 political commandments, and all 10 of them. I'm like, this just needs to be something that everybody reads and does and learns for dialogue with anybody. Like, same beliefs, different beliefs, all of it, on a political level, a theological level, a like whatever you're talking about. And that's something that helps me be like, I endorse it for anybody, no matter where you live. So
That's awesome. Yeah, and on those 10 political commandments, part of the backdrop to that was just try to give some clear guidelines. So these were not, we jokingly referred to them as the 10 political commandments because we didn't want people to think like they're the same as the actual 10 commandments God gives Moses on Mount Sinai. But when they are actually things God commands in Scripture of us as His people, and too often I think people can kind of go, "Oh, those things are good for your kind of personal life, but they don't apply out here in the quote unquote real world, sphere."
mhm.
And the Bible doesn't. I don't think Jesus gives us that exception clause. Like these are actually things God commands us. And so an example of what some of these were, the first one was worship, saying, I commit my allegiance to King Jesus over all idols and ideologies. The second one was love of neighbor. I commit to participating in civic life as a means of loving and serving my neighbor rather than just serving my own interests. And then it went on. There were, ones on like the image of God and biblical wisdom and biblical justice and fruitful speech, on peacemaking, removing the log out of our own eye, humble learning, and loving our enemies. And going, these are, again, there's no exception clause. These are things that God commands for us as His people. And I think if we were to approach the political arena living these things out, we would still have our convictions. We would still vote or do whatever, like we would still be involved politically. But I think it would have a different aroma, like it would carry a witness that I think would glorify Christ and promote unity, even amidst our difference, rather than
Yeah.
some of the vitriol and the fracturing that we see today.
Yeah. And so what you're even saying too, just to clarify, is that Christians should engage in politics, and that this should be not something that we shy away from because it's like, oh, I just need to, in order to be like Jesus, not really do anything and silence myself and, just bury my head in the sand, the ostrich method. Uh, but you're not saying that. You're saying, no, this is something that you very much can be a part of and even should be a part of.
Totally, yeah. So I'm not advocating that people become apolitical or just centrist as possible, which I think, the message of the book is not, oh, why can't we all just get along and just not talk about the hard thing? It's more giving some guidelines and guardrails for here's how to do this well. I think, here's how to be involved politically, but without compromising your character, without letting your political meaning become sort of an idolatrous vow that competes with your allegiance to Christ. That actually, because I'm seeing that too often. I use the image earlier in the book of like some of what I'm seeing with many people's devotion to their party, is something more like a religious conversion, like that. It's
Hmm.
like they're converting to these other ideologies in ways that are subverting their allegiance to Jesus, and so if you were to wake up tomorrow and a third of your church had converted to, some converted to Buddhism, some to Islam, some to, I don't know, one dude's now a Zoroastrian or something, you'd be like, dude, what is going on, and you'd be trying to understand what's happening, and they're trying to share the faith with all their other friends. They still show up at church, but they're still trying to convert all these other people and take them with them. And they're posting all their favorite mantras on Instagram or whatever. You'd go, man, something's wrong. And I suggest in the book that something like that has happened. Like, it may not be a third of our people, but there's a lot. And I think the reason we don't see it as religious conversion is because they're not converting to the old school world religions. They're converting to the new school political religions, which
Hmm.
um, which is, I kind of argue for what those are, and when does it become like a religion? Because I do think there's, a place for political philosophy and ideas and ideology. I love that stuff, but there's a level of devotion and zeal today that has taken on a religious character, where
Yeah.
historically the root of the word religion historically had to do with like devotion that came with kind of these sacred obligations and commitments and things like that. And for many people today, their greatest devotion and zeal is to their political ideology, and their party
Yeah.
kind of deal. Um, and in a way that I think it's crashing their faith in Jesus, whether
Yeah.
they recognize it or not.
Yeah, so your claim is that not only can politics be a form of religion or be religious, but also you have a claim that your religion, or even just your follow, like your devotion to Jesus, calling
Mm-hmm.
Jesus Lord, is religious. It's a religious act. I mean, sorry, not a religious, a political act.
Mm.
Um, can you explain that?
Great. Yeah, totally. Yeah, so many terms in the New Testament, like gospel, savior, Lord, faith, these are politically loaded terms. Like in the New Testament, they were politically loaded in the time of the early church. So, for example, um, the Roman Empire declared the gospel or good news that Caesar was savior and Lord, and that the people were called to put their faith or trust in him, like
Mm.
which meant like kind of their allegiance to him as their ruler. And so when the early church stepped in and said, actually, we're bringing the good news that Jesus is Savior and Lord. He's the one who's reconciling creation to God. It's through him this peace of God is. It's a different kind of rule than Caesar's, but he is Lord. Put your faith in him, your trust, give him your allegiance. That's politically loaded. So we as the church today, we believe that Jesus is King of Kings, Lord of Lords, not of some other world, but of this world, that God has given him all authority in heaven and on earth, as he says in Matthew 28, that God's given him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow and tongue confess. So that's a political statement. Like the gospel is more political than many people at times think. And that confronts sort of this sacred secular divide, I think, that many people have, where it's sort of like, okay, Jesus goes in the sacred box where he's for your personal life and the invisible spiritual world over there. But politics goes in the secular box that's just for the real world and the concrete life that we live here. It's going, no, Jesus is Lord of all. Like he's actually been exalted as the King of Kings. We're putting our faith, our trust in him, giving him our ultimate allegiance and seeking to align our lives with his kingdom reign. And that shapes how we live as citizens here in our country, citizens whose highest allegiance is to Jesus.
Yeah. So, in just a few nuggets, then, what are some ways that Christians right now, here today, can engage in politics faithfully?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot in the book, like so.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I talk about is some different options, right? So creative options. I think for many Christians today, they often feel like they only have three options. You kind of have the donkey option, for the Democrats, or the elephant option with the Republicans, or the ostrich option, which is bury your head in the sand and wait, hope it all blows over,
Yeah.
But I argue in one of the chapters, there's actually six other options, six creative options for political involvement. So one of those is the first one is the local option,
Hmm.
going. we're often obsessed with national politics and which box you're going to check for the presidential vote, whatever. And that's important. But the reality is, you can have a way bigger practical impact in your local community, your local city. And so um, there's, a buddy of mine who ran for office in his city, and dude, he lost by 32 votes for city council.
Dang.
It's like, dude, I had that many people at my birthday party. It's like,
Yeah.
you could have an impact at that level there, right? But also going like, we started these things called prayer and action groups last election season, which was a challenge for our people who were the most ramped up about national stuff and going, hey, I want to challenge you to get into one of these prayer and action groups. We had first one was on two of them, one on sanctity of life and one on criminal justice, which were issues that people would tend to, on the left and the right, each care a lot about. And the call was, can you commit to 1 year of gathering together 12 to 15 people, reading the best stuff you can find on it, meeting with local leaders who are working on this issue, praying intentionally over this year, and then committing to some concrete action that we can take in our city to actually have a constructive impact. And the fruit locally was phenomenal, and it actually, I think that's the way of the kingdom is often. Jesus says it's the yeast in the dough that eventually works its way through. It's not necessarily starting big, it starts small and it can grow and have big impact. So the local option. Second option, I call it the Daniel option. And so that's named after Daniel in the Old Testament, where he essentially rises to political office in Babylon. And he's able to navigate that faithfully. And I've had multiple politicians in churches where I pastored who have, sought to navigate faithfully being a Christian and being in the political sphere. And what I found is often that requires discernment to do it well. So if we think of Daniel, for example, I love in Daniel chapter 1, where Babylon wants him to basically assimilate. And he refuses to eat food from the king's table, kind of the meat from the king's table, but he allows them to name him after a pagan god. And for me, I'm going, come on, Daniel, like, dude, take the steak, but don't let them name you after some foreign idol, but
Yeah.
he's commended in scripture for it. And theologians, biblical scholars are confused. Why is he commended for that? That doesn't seem like the obvious course of action. But what I think one of the things we see there is that there is a need for discernment before God, that people in those positions are going to have to navigate some of the complexity of, politics is often the art of coming to the table, and you get some of what you want, they get some of what they want, and so navigating those things well. Third option is the prophetic options. This is like Martin Luther King Jr., right? Where prophetic imagination, where unlike the Daniel option, you're not working from within the system, you're more coming from outside the system, but bringing a creative prophetic imagination for how things could look differently. The fourth option is the scuba option. This would be people like William Wilberforce historically, or those of people I know in our church who have gone deep in one particular issue. So I show the story of Jenny, who's worked for 20 years in like foster care and vulnerable children and things like that. And started out not for 20 years, for a long time. And she is not officially like a politician, but when the politicians and all are writing policy, she's the person they come to help shape public policy, because she doesn't know a bunch of surface sound bites about 50 issues. She really knows the intricacies and ins and outs of one issue that she's been working tirelessly on for a long time. And so I think that's an area, is go deep in one area that can contribute to civic flourishing. A fifth option is the monastic option. And this one is, we often think the monks were withdrawing and retreating from the world, but I discussed how they actually had this radical transformational impact in education and agriculture and renewal and poverty relief and development, like all these things that they did crazy work for that was so impactful. And similarly, the monastic option here, it's about forming an alternative community in the midst of the empire, so to speak, that lives into the vision and values that you want to see embodied as a whole. And so this is a good option, I think, for some people who just feel so disillusioned and exhausted with politics and the system, and just like, I gotta check out, But rather than checking out and just watching Netflix and entertaining yourself or whatever, like you can maybe check out of that bigger piece, but pour your energy instead into that alternative community, your church or something like that, that you're creating that alternative. And then the final option I talk about is the reform option, which is um, we all know that politics is broken. And so these are things that are seeking to reform the system to make it healthier. And you can work across party lines in these reform options, things like talk about like campaign finance reform or ranked choice voting or proportional representation. Not that everybody has to agree with those, but those are avenues some people are working to try and create a healthier political system and political culture.
Yeah, totally. I think one of my favorites was the first one, the local option, because you mentioned, I believe it was on this one, you attached the story of it was somebody that you knew or something about how the local government was trying to raise the interest rates. Do you know what story I'm talking about?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, could you share that? Because that one's really compelling to me.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So there was an initiative that was had to do with like the payday loans and loan sharks and that kind of thing, where basically the interest rate, I can't remember off head, but it's something like over 200% APR over the first year or whatever, which is just insane. It was going to really affect impoverished communities in our city. It was going to push people further into poverty. And the way that we realized, the church, the network we were part of, realized those such issues because there were church leaders who were in those communities, like their churches were in those communities and people in their churches were going to be affected. And because of that relationship across socioeconomic lines, the network was made aware of it. And so pastors and churches across the city joined together through this network to advocate against that bill getting passed. And it was shut down, and the shutdown was attributed to the advocacy and involvement of local church leaders in stepping in, as part of this network. So I think that the action there of the body of Christ being in relationship across the city, across socioeconomic lines, and being willing and able to advocate for people in our city who are going to be dramatically affected had a great impact.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good. Uh, one of the motifs, just to switch gears a little bit, one of the main motifs throughout the book is the concept of keeping, like, you can keep your lean, but as a Christian, your bow belongs to Jesus. And that ultimately the question is, where does your allegiance lie? So you may lean left, you may lean right, you may lean somewhere in the middle. But if you're a follower of Jesus, you have committed yourself to calling Jesus Lord, which you said is a political statement, right? Kurios. In Roman days, in the time of the New Testament writers, and they were supposed to either call, they were supposed to call Caesar Lord, Kurios. And then the Christians came along and said, actually, he's not our Lord. He's not our master. But in fact, Jesus is, and that's who my allegiance is towards. And yeah, so I guess with this whole question of allegiance, this is getting a little bit, this wasn't mentioned in the book or anything. This is something that I wanted to ask you, because growing up, I went to the school that I was a part of. It was actually even a Christian school. But what they used to have us do, and I think this is pretty widespread, I don't know, I didn't really go to a multitude of different schools, but I think this is common, is like you pledge allegiance to the flag. And it's the whole line. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And only recently have I reflected on that and thought, or at least posed the question: should I have pledged my allegiance to my country if my allegiance is supposed to be towards Jesus? I want to know your thoughts on that.
Great question. Yeah. So I'll give you my bent. I know some friends of mine, actually, some people I know who struggle with pledging allegiance to the flag because it feels like, oh, I'm giving my allegiance to something else. I personally don't have an issue with it as long as it's properly framed. And here's where I would kind of go. Jesus is called the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and that seems to me to be different from saying he's king and nobody else is,
Mhm.
but it's framing any authority on this earth, whether a parent or a government or the government leader or whatever, a boss, there are real authorities in our world. You do have a boss, you do have, parents, you do have leaders in different spheres of society, and that's not bad. I think God gives leadership as a good gift for when it's done well for the flourishing of this world. But all of those are ultimately subservient beneath the ultimate lordship of Jesus as King. And similarly, I think our allegiance is to the King and His kingdom. So my highest allegiance is to Christ and His kingdom. But I don't think that means that I abdicate, my citizenship as a citizen of the country that I'm in. Paul was able and willing to use his Roman citizenship in the Book of Acts to advocate for himself, and I think that there can be a healthy patriotism if you think of like a devotion to one's country, to one's family, to one's neighborhood, to one's community, hey, this is at different concentric circles. This is the proximate, like the place that I've been put in proximity to different relationships, different institutions to actually try and contribute to the flourishing of society in my world. And so I think, to be able to go, I'm going to pledge my allegiance to like my parents and the leaders of my community when I become a member of a church per se, or in this country I'm in. But the caveat there is that those are always qualified beneath the authority of Christ. And so if my government, if my boss, if anyone above me like calls me to do something counter to the person of Christ, the way of Christ, sorry, I'm checking that obedience at the door. My higher obedience is Jesus. And so I'm okay with, but I think the danger becomes, and you see this in different times in history where pledging allegiance to one's country, whether that's Nazi Germany or whatever it might be, becomes sort of like you're subsuming God beneath that authority rather than
Yeah.
holding that authority in check before God. And so rather than, God bless America, for example, I think the gospel calls, hey, America, bless God, turn and, turn towards God as the higher authority. And so if that makes sense. So I personally don't have an issue with pledging allegiance so long as that allegiance is framed beneath for me, like the higher allegiance that I give to the King of Kings and His kingdom over any earthly kingdom.
Yeah. Okay, I like that answer. It's good. Going back to the partisan conversation, what are your thoughts on the dichotomy of the Republican tribe, the Democratic tribe? Should Christians ascribe to one, or should we try and almost be a party crasher? I mean, and that's what the whole book is about. But like, on a more specific level, if I identify as a Republican or as a Democrat publicly, maybe that's in my Twitter bio or something, like a Republican follower of Jesus. How does being a party crasher sit within possibly also identifying within one of those parties? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. No, I think it's great to be in a party, to identify with the party. So maybe I can unpack a little bit how I use the term party crasher, because I think the goal is though that you actually become a more Christ-like person within your party, rather than letting the party distort your witness and your allegiance to Christ. Because I think the danger is, I think all the parties right now, there are people spending billions of dollars trying to convert your allegiance to an ultimate party platform that is not, I'd say on both sides. And even I go in the book into 4 different quadrants, and none of them are fully compatible with our allegiance to Jesus. And so, but to explain what I mean by party crasher, I was in high school and I had this buddy, Kyle, who I was the book nerd, he was the jock football star, and our circles would never hang out together, But I remember my birthday party, I didn't even think to invite him because there's no way, but he crashed my party and he showed up, and I didn't have a ton of friends. He called me into this whole eclectic community that he pulled together that had, like, you had the goths and the misfits and the nerds and the football stars and the, it was just everybody. It was just, it didn't make sense by your typical high school clique standards, but it was all of us together. And Kyle was like a party crasher, dude. He like crashed and disrupted these different cliques and little social bubbles that we would get into in kind of high school politics. And he gathered together this eclectic community that was distinct, and he threw a better party, and similarly, I think Jesus is like that. Like Jesus, you can't fit Jesus in the Republican box or the Democrat box, right?
Yeah.
Like he's over both of them. And Jesus, he has unfettered access. He can crash into those parties and call us out into a bigger platform, his kingdom that actually, I believe the values of his kingdom at times will align with different positions in either party. And I talk about some of those in the book, but it also will confront different aspects ideologically in both of those parties. And so I think giving our ultimate allegiance means that pragmatically we can participate in a particular party and be a part of that. We may feel fully convinced like that's going to be a better vision for our country. But it's going to qualify it's going to qualify our participation in a way where we don't give it our full allegiance. And there will be ways, I think, that we end up standing out and not fully aligning with our party in different areas. And that can make us weird, because we don't necessarily fit the boxes. And that's okay. Like the early church was weird too. They didn't quite fit the boxes. And yet I'll take Jesus, man. If faithfulness to Jesus means I got to stand out and look a little weird, then I'll take it.
Yeah, and even in regard to the question, with the Kyle example you gave, I mean, you described him as a football player, a jock, and he might have even described himself as that. It's like, oh, Kyle, what do you do? He might have said, oh, I'm captain of the football team, or, whatever. And yet you're saying even within that little party, that high school political party that he was in, he was still like, it didn't keep him from being with everybody and being the life of the party, wherever he was, with any group of people he was with. So I like that word. I like that picture.
Totally. Yeah. And if I could add to that too, I think of in the Gospels when Jesus calls his disciples, he calls a very eclectic group, so he calls like revolutionary zealots, he calls like tax collectors who are sort of defending the status quo, he calls like blue collar fishermen, white collar doctors. Like she just gathers a really eclectic community. And if you take like the zealot and tax collector, for example, I mean, the zealots wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire, and the tax collectors were seen as like collaborators, compromisers, that were gleaning off the system, and they hated each other, and so Jesus calls both. That would be like, I don't know, inviting a Occupy Wall Streeter and a Wall Street CEO, or getting Ben Shapiro and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like both into your small group or something, and like Jesus does that. He gets them both into a small group, into his band of 12 disciples. And I like to imagine like, what were the campfire conversations at night like that? Like you're doing ministry together during the day and you're processing through everything you're seeing at night. And there had to be immense conflict. Like I love that new TV show, The Chosen, or whatever. Like it shows, I think it's imaginative. It was showing like some of the conflicted things that different folks and the disciples would have had. And I think it's just a taste of like, yeah, but Jesus is intentional in who he calls, because I believe he's gathering a politically diverse community of disciples. That the church is not only Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female, all that, but it's also breaking some of those barriers of political leaning and all. He's like Kyle. He's creating that eclectic community.
Yeah. I guess one of the last questions then that I have is, oftentimes I think I see people who become like super allegiant towards one particular party or one particular belief system, actually because they think that is this, like, that's what it means to follow Jesus. So, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat because Jesus is a Democrat. And so, if I'm going to be faithful to Jesus, then I have to ascribe to this party because they believe in this about social justice. They believe this about abortion. They believe like whatever it is. And so in their mind, following Jesus and being a part of this political group is actually, they're synonymous. They work together. So how do you respond to those people?
Yeah. Man, so biggest response is, man, I think that, dude, Jesus confronts things in both parties, and maybe here's what one way of looking at it is like, I think how to sum this up without uh, relying too heavily on the book. But in the book, I talk about like the four political quadrants, right? So I talk
Yeah.
about how we tend to think left, right today, but I argue that there's also a top-down axis of modernity to post-modernity, and that is split kind of both of the political parties. And so you see some of the deepest fighting today is not necessarily just between left and right, but between different camps on the left and different camps on the right. And what I see people on both sides doing, including like pastors and church leaders today, is when they want to advocate for their side, what they'll do is tend to uh, use the most extreme, crazy, whatever, extreme postmodern, extreme deconstruct, like extreme wild examples from the other side, but then use kind of the most sane, moderate, whatever, or kind of a very laid back understanding of their own side. And so you see each side doing this, like, the left will point to the most extreme examples on the right will point to the most extreme examples on the left. But I believe that Jesus calls us, when he calls us to take the log out of our own eye before seeking to take the plank out of our brother's eye, he's calling us to start with our side, right? Like to start with ourselves. And I think our side, that it should provoke a humility, I think, to actually look at what are some of the flaws, weaknesses, shortcomings in our own political tribe. If you are in a particular party, like being willing to take an honest look at how does the gospel confront, how does Jesus confront some of the things that are present on my side of the political aisle. What are some of the more extreme, crazy, whatever things on my side that actually are unhealthy and not good? And that doesn't mean that you never point out problems in the other side. But when you start with yourself and you start with your side, I think it cultivates a type of humility where Jesus, he doesn't say only take the log out of your own eye. He says take the log out, or take, so that you can then see clearly to take the plank out. And I think the humility, when we look at the flaws and weaknesses and shortcomings in our own side, that humility will help us to more clearly and better be positioned to actually help address some of the problems and the flaws in the other political side as well.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Josh, thank you so much for spending this time with me, getting to talk about this book. Is there a specific place that you can send people if they want to check out more of your work? Obviously, buy this book.
Yeah. No, thanks. Yeah, if you go to my website, it's joshuaryanbutler.com. So joshuaryanbutler.com, and it's got more details on the book. It's got some resources. So for example, that Christian political commitment we talked about earlier with the 10 political commandments, that's a free download there. There's some other resources. If you're a pastor looking for like some sample sermon outlines and things based on this, a lot of those free resources are out there, as well as links to all the different places that carry the book, or at least a lot of them. And yeah, I'm mostly on Instagram and Facebook these days. Joshua Butler PDX, yeah, is my handle. But yeah, would love to connect with folks. If listeners maybe check it out, would love to hear your thoughts. So feel free to hit me up online, and would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Josh. Guys, like I said, you won't regret reading the book. It's a fabulous one, The Party Crasher. Thanks for chatting, Josh.
Thank you, Ethan. Appreciate it.